Dearest listeners, it has been observed by this author that the cruelest betrayals often wear the most charming faces, and that salvation may arrive bearing the exact countenance of one's destruction. But before we embark upon this extraordinary journey through the scandals and redemptions of Regency society, do kindly press the like button and subscribe to ensure you never miss another of these tales of passion and propriety. Today, your humble chronicler brings you the most extraordinary tale of a young lady whose ruin became her redemption, and a gentleman who discovered that honor could bloom from the ashes of his brother's disgrace. But let us not rush, for the best stories, like the finest Madeira, must be savored properly. The drawing rooms of Bath in the spring of 1817 hummed with the usual symphony of gossip and genteel observations, yet none could have predicted the tragedy about to unfold within the respectable household of the late Admiral Crawford. Miss Isabella Crawford, possessing that particular combination of beauty and innocence that renders young ladies simultaneously protected and vulnerable, had reached her 19th year with all the promise of an advantageous match before her. Admiral Crawford had departed this world some 18 months prior, leaving his daughter in the care of his sister, Mrs. Prudence Whitmore, a woman whose dedication to propriety exceeded only her parsimony. The Admiral's fortune, while respectable, had been considerably diminished by poor investments in the final years of his life, leaving Isabella with a modest dowry of £2,000, sufficient to attract fortune hunters, insufficient to secure the attention of truly eligible gentlemen. Isabella possessed what society deemed dangerous gifts for a woman of limited means: intelligence that sparkled in her hazel eyes, wit that occasionally escaped despite her aunt's frequent admonishments, and a figure that even the empire waists of current fashion could not entirely disguise. Her chestnut hair, when caught by candlelight, revealed threads of gold that seemed to mock her reduced circumstances. She had been educated perhaps too well for her station, her father having indulged her love of books and music during his lifetime, creating accomplishments that now seemed merely to emphasize what she could no longer afford to be. The household in Laura Place maintained a precarious respectability. Mrs. Whitmore, whose own husband had left her comfortably situated but not wealthy, calculated every expense with the precision of a military quartermaster. Isabella's wardrobe consisted of 3 evening gowns, carefully maintained and subtly altered each season to suggest variety where none existed. Her days followed a pattern as predictable as the pump room's schedule: morning calls that never quite materialized into invitations, afternoon walks along the Royal Crescent where she might observe but not fully participate in society's pageant, and evenings spent reading by insufficient candlelight while her aunt dozed over her needlework. It was during the lower assembly room's Thursday gathering, one of the few entertainments Mrs. Whitmore deemed both respectable and affordable, that Isabella first encountered Lord Benedict Blackmore. The younger son of the Earl of Ravensdale, Lord Benedict possessed that particular magnetism that second sons often cultivate when fortune of birth has denied them fortune of inheritance. His appearance that April evening caused the usual flutter among the marriage-minded mammas and their charges. For while his expectations were limited to a modest estate in Devonshire and £1,000 per annum, his connection to the Ravensdale title rendered him decidedly eligible. What distinguished Lord Benedict from his elder twin brother, Lord Thomas Blackmore, heir to the earldom, was immediately apparent to any who had encountered both gentlemen. Where Lord Thomas was reserved to the point of severity, Benedict sparkled with wit and charm. Where Thomas had devoted himself to the management of the family estates and matters of business, Benedict had perfected the art of being amusing in drawing rooms across England. They were as different as two men sharing the same features could possibly be, one formed of duty and restraint, the other of pleasure and impulse. Isabella's introduction to Lord Benedict came through the offices of Mrs. Fairweather, a mutual acquaintance whose social aspirations exceeded her actual position, but whose connections remained useful. The introduction was performed with all proper ceremony during the interval between country dances, and Isabella, making her curtsy, felt the full force of Lord Benedict's considerable charm directed upon her like sunlight through a magnifying glass. His attentions throughout that evening maintained precisely the correct degree of propriety, while suggesting something altogether more thrilling beneath the surface. He claimed her hand for 2 dances, the maximum permitted without causing comment, and during the intervals positioned himself within her vicinity with such apparent casualness that only the most astute observer would note the deliberation behind each movement. His conversation sparkled with references to London, to people and places Isabella had only read about, painting pictures of a world that seemed to exist in perpetual golden light compared to the gray respectability of her current situation. Mrs. Whitmore, observing from her position among the chaperones, experienced the simultaneous elation and terror that guardians feel when their charges attract attention above their established station. Lord Benedict's interest was unmistakable, his eligibility undeniable, yet something in his manner, perhaps the ease with which compliments fell from his lips, or the practiced way he guided Isabella through the dance figures, suggested a man perhaps too accomplished in the art of courtship. Over the following weeks, Lord Benedict's pursuit of Isabella followed a pattern as intricate as any dance. He appeared at the pump room at precisely the hour when she took the waters with her aunt. He materialized during their walks, always with perfect propriety, always with some companion who could provide the necessary introductions and observations. He sent flowers, nothing too extravagant, nothing that could be construed as improper, with notes that skirted the edge of ardent while maintaining plausible deniability. The transformation of Isabella Crawford from cautious young lady to besotted girl occurred with such subtle gradation that even she could not later identify the precise moment when reasonable affection transformed into desperate love. Lord Benedict Blackmore possessed that particular genius for seduction that operates not through crude assault, but through the careful dismantling of defenses, each protective wall removed so gently that its absence was only noticed when the citadel had already fallen. His campaign began with books. Having discovered Isabella's love of reading during one of their carefully orchestrated encounters at Mailer's library, Lord Benedict began recommending volumes with such perfect calibration to her tastes that each suggestion felt like a private understanding between them. He would mention, quite casually, that he had left a particular novel at the library for her perusal, always something just slightly beyond what her aunt would normally approve. Byron when she was accustomed to Cowper, Gothic novels when she typically read improving works. Each book became a secret rebellion, a tiny step away from the suffocating propriety of her aunt's household. Then came the letters. Nothing improper at first, merely notes accompanying the flowers, observations about the weather or the previous evening's entertainment. But gradually, by degrees so minute as to be almost imperceptible, they grew warmer. A comment about how the morning sun could not compare to the light in her eyes. An observation that the assembly room seemed dimmed when she was absent. Each letter pushed slightly further, but always with such poetic delicacy that to object would seem prudish rather than prudent. Mrs. Whitmore, for all her dedication to propriety, found herself outmaneuvered at every turn. Lord Benedict never called without proper notice, never stayed beyond the prescribed 15 minutes, never suggested anything that could be definitively labeled inappropriate. Yet somehow, he managed to create moments of intimacy within the strict confines of social convention. A hand that lingered just a heartbeat too long when helping Isabella with her shawl. A whispered observation during a concert that required him to lean closer than strictly necessary. A look held across a crowded room that conveyed more than hours of conversation. By the end of May, Isabella found herself completely entranced. Lord Benedict had become the sun around which her days orbited. She rose thinking of when she might see him, spent her afternoons reliving their encounters, and fell asleep composing responses to things he had said, clever rejoinders she never quite managed to voice in his actual presence. Her aunt noticed the change, the distraction during morning prayers, the sudden interest in her appearance, the way she startled whenever a card was delivered, but attributed it to the natural awakening of a young woman's romantic sensibilities. The crisis began with an invitation to a picnic at Prior Park, hosted by the Fairweathers. Such outdoor entertainments provided opportunities for less rigid supervision, and Lord Benedict exploited every possibility. While the other guests admired the Palladian Bridge, he guided Isabella to a slightly secluded grove, ostensibly to show her a particularly fine view of the city below. There, with the sound of distant laughter providing an illusion of propriety, he made his first declaration, The words he chose were calculated to overwhelm any defense a young woman might mount. He spoke of love at first sight, of sleepless nights, of a future that could only be complete with her presence. He painted pictures of their life together, not grand perhaps, given his position as a second son, but filled with a devotion that would more than compensate for any material limitations. He spoke of his modest estate in Devonshire as though it were paradise itself, needing only her presence to achieve perfection. Isabella, whose experience of masculine attention had been limited to the tepid interest of local curates and elderly widowers, found herself drowning in the flood of Lord Benedict's passion. When he took her hand improperly without gloves, the shock of skin against skin seemed to seal a covenant between them. When he begged for some sign that his feelings were reciprocated, she could only nod, tears of overwhelming emotion preventing speech. From that moment, their relationship accelerated with dangerous momentum. Lord Benedict began pressing for private meetings, always couched in terms of desperate romantic necessity. He could not bear, he claimed, to continue their courtship under the watchful eyes of society. Did she not trust him? Did she not feel, as he did, that their love transcended ordinary conventions? He began to speak of impediments to their formal engagement. His father's expectations that he marry an heiress, his own need to establish himself before he could offer for her properly. But these obstacles, he assured her, were temporary. Love would find a way. The turning point came in late June, during the festivities surrounding the anniversary of Waterloo. Bath society had outdone itself with a grand ball at the upper assembly rooms, and Isabella, wearing her best evening gown of Pomona green silk, felt almost equal to the occasion. Lord Benedict was particularly attentive that evening, claiming her for the maximum 2 dances and hovering nearby during the others. As the evening progressed and the champagne flowed more freely, he suggested a turn on the terrace to escape the heat of the ballroom. The terrace, silvered by moonlight and cooled by the evening breeze, seemed to exist outside the normal rules of society. Other couples strolled at a discreet distance, providing the illusion of chaperonage without actual supervision. It was there that Lord Benedict made his fatal proposition. He loved her, he declared, too much to continue this charade of public courtship. His father would never approve the match, not with Isabella's limited dowry and his own dependence on family goodwill. But if they were to anticipate their vows, if they were to belong to each other in truth before they could be united in law, then no force on earth could separate them. The sophistication of his argument would have impressed a more experienced woman. He spoke of souls united beyond the mere conventions of society, of a love that transcended earthly institutions. He quoted poetry, some of it quite possibly his own composition, about the sacred nature of true union. He assured her that in his heart, before God, she was already his wife. All that remained was for her to acknowledge the same truth. Isabella's resistance, such as it was, crumbled not under the assault of passion, but beneath the weight of a terrible fear that refusing him might mean losing him entirely. The thought of returning to the gray monotony of her life without the golden possibility of Lord Benedict's love seemed a death sentence. When he suggested a secret rendezvous, a place where they could pledge themselves to each other without the world's interference, she found herself agreeing with a sense of stepping off a cliff into darkness. The location he chose was calculatedly romantic, a small cottage on the outskirts of Bath that belonged, he claimed, to a friend traveling abroad. He gave her elaborate instructions for reaching it undetected, involving a hired chair, a veiled bonnet, and a circuitous route that would prevent any connection to either of them. Isabella, her heart pounding with equal parts terror and exhilaration, followed these instructions with the precision of a military campaign. What transpired in that cottage on that fatal July afternoon would haunt Isabella for months afterward. Lord Benedict had prepared the scene with theatrical perfection. Flowers, wine, a cold collation that suggested permanence rather than sordid liaison. He spoke again of marriage, of vows exchanged before heaven, if not before men. He produced a ring, not expensive, but pretty enough, and placed it on her finger with words that sounded almost like a genuine ceremony. And then, with a combination of persistence, persuasion, and the exploitation of her complete inexperience, he claimed what he had come for. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Lord Benedict, having achieved his conquest, discovered urgent business that required his immediate departure from Bath. His letters, previously so frequent, dwindled to occasional notes. His promises of future arrangements became increasingly vague. When Isabella, desperate and frightened, sent word that she needed to see him urgently, he responded that his father had summoned him to London, and he knew not when he might return. The full horror of Isabella's situation revealed itself with the inexorable progression of nature. By August, certain signs that even an innocent young lady could not ignore made themselves manifest. The morning sickness that she attempted to hide from her aunt by claiming a summer ague. The changes to her body that her maid, thankfully loyal, pretended not to notice. The calendar that marked with terrifying clarity the absence of what should have been present. Her letters to Lord Benedict became increasingly frantic, though she dared not commit the full truth to paper. She wrote of urgent matters requiring his attention, of decisions that could not be delayed, of her desperate need for his counsel. His responses, when they came at all, were studies in evasion. His father's health was delicate. Business matters required his presence in London. He would return to Bath as soon as circumstances permitted. Each letter was shorter than the last, until finally they ceased altogether. By September, when the awful truth could no longer be denied even to herself, Isabella made a desperate decision. She would go to London. She would find Lord Benedict and force him to acknowledge his responsibilities. The journey required elaborate deception. She told her aunt she had been invited to visit a school friend in Bristol, a lie that required forging both invitation and subsequent correspondence. The money for the journey came from pawning the few pieces of jewelry her mother had left her, family treasures sacrificed for coach fare and lodging. London in autumn was a labyrinth of confusion for a young woman accustomed to Bath's manageable scope. Isabella had memorized the Blackmore family's London address from Lord Benedict's letters, but finding the courage to present herself at the door of Ravensdale House in Grosvenor Square required every ounce of desperate determination she possessed. The footman who answered her knock looked at her with the particular blend of suspicion and disdain reserved for young women of gentle appearance but no calling card who arrived unaccompanied at noble houses. When she asked for Lord Benedict, claiming urgent business, the footman's expression shifted from suspicion to knowing contempt. Lord Benedict, he informed her with barely concealed satisfaction, had departed 3 days prior for an extended tour of the continent. He was not expected back for at least 6 months, possibly longer. The door closed in Isabella's face with a finality that seemed to echo through her entire being. Standing on the pavement outside Ravensdale House, Isabella felt the full weight of her ruin descending upon her. She was pregnant, abandoned, alone in London, with barely enough money for the return journey to Bath. The ring Lord Benedict had given her, that mockery of marriage, felt like a shackle on her finger. She pulled it off and nearly threw it in the gutter before practical desperation stayed her hand. It might, at least, pay for a few more nights' lodging. It was at this moment of absolute despair that fate intervened in the form of a collision. Isabella, blinded by tears and stumbling on the unfamiliar pavement, walked directly into a gentleman emerging from Ravensdale House. The impact sent her reeling, and she would have fallen had not strong hands caught her arms, steadying her with surprising gentleness. When she looked up, the shock nearly caused her to faint. The face, looking down at her with concern, was Lord Benedict's face. The same dark eyes, the same aristocratic features, the same mouth that had whispered such sweet lies. But the expression was entirely different. Grave where Benedict's had been merry, concerned where his had been calculating, and marked by tiny lines of responsibility that Benedict's careless existence had never earned. This was Lord Thomas Blackmore, heir to the Earl of Ravensdale, and the confusion in his eyes as he looked at Isabella's tear-stained face suggested he had no knowledge of his twin brother's activities. His first words, spoken with genuine concern, were to inquire if she was injured. His second, noting her obvious distress, was to ask if he could be of assistance. The irony of the moment, that the brother should offer help where the seducer had fled, was so acute that Isabella almost laughed. Instead, she did something that surprised them both. She looked him directly in the eye and said with perfect clarity that yes, he could indeed be of assistance, as she had business with his family that could not be delayed. The boldness of this statement, coming from a young woman who was obviously gentle, but equally obviously in distress, seemed to intrigue Lord Thomas. He studied her face with an intensity that made her want to flee, but desperation kept her rooted to the spot. After a long moment, he made a decision that would alter both their fates. Rather than dismissing her or directing her to his secretary, he invited her into Ravensdale House. Not through the main entrance, he was too aware of proprieties for that, but through a side door that led to a small study where business matters were conducted. He sent for tea, dismissed the servants, and with a gravity that suggested he suspected the nature of her business, asked her to explain her connection to his family. The study in Ravensdale House seemed to exist in a different world from the cottage where Isabella had lost her innocence. Where that had been all soft furnishings and romantic staging, this room spoke of serious purpose. Legal tomes lined the walls, estate maps spread across a massive oak desk, portraits of stern ancestors gazed down with disapproving eyes. Lord Thomas Blackmore stood by the fireplace, his posture suggesting a man braced for unpleasant news, while Isabella sat in a leather chair that seemed to swallow her slight frame. The tea he had ordered sat untouched between them, the delicate china incongruous with the weight of the moment. Isabella had prepared a dozen speeches during her desperate journey to London, but faced with this man who wore her seducer's face yet seemed carved from entirely different stone, words failed her. The silence stretched until it became physically painful, broken only by the tick of an ornate clock that seemed to count down the moments until her complete destruction. Finally, Lord Thomas spoke, his voice gentle but firm. He had recognized, he said, the signs of a lady in severe distress. He had also noted her reaction upon seeing his face, the shock followed by recognition, followed by something that looked very much like despair. Given that she had been inquiring after his brother, and given Benedict's sudden departure for the continent, he could draw certain conclusions. However, he would prefer to hear the truth from her own lips, and he assured her that whatever she revealed would be received with the consideration due to any lady, regardless of circumstances. It was his use of the word lady that broke Isabella's composure. Tears came then, not the gentle tears prescribed for feminine distress, but great, gasping sobs that shook her entire frame. Lord Thomas neither approached to comfort nor withdrew in embarrassment. He simply waited, occasionally pushing his handkerchief closer to her reach, until the storm passed and she could speak. The story, when it finally emerged, was told with a frankness that would have shocked society, but seemed to impress Lord Thomas with its honesty. Isabella held nothing back. The careful seduction, the false promises, the abandoned cottage, the growing evidence of her condition, the desperate journey to London. She spoke without attempting to minimize her own culpability or to paint herself as entirely innocent. She had been foolish, she admitted, but she had also been deliberately deceived by a man who had presented himself as honorable. Throughout her recitation, Lord Thomas's expression grew increasingly grim. When she described the mock marriage ceremony Benedict had performed, his hands clenched into fists. When she mentioned the letters that had gradually ceased, a muscle twitched in his jaw. By the time she finished, explaining her presence at his door and her collision with him on the street, he looked like a man who had aged several years in the span of minutes. The silence that followed was different from the earlier one, charged now with his anger rather than her fear. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled but trembling with suppressed fury. His brother, he said, had done this before. Not to this extent, perhaps, but there had been other girls, other scandals hushed with money and threats. Their father had always excused Benedict's behavior as youthful high spirits, had always been ready with funds to clean up his messes. But this was beyond anything that could be swept away with gold. He asked with characteristic directness what Isabella intended to do. Did she have family who would support her? Resources to see her through her confinement? Plans for the child once it arrived? Each negative answer seemed to increase his agitation, until he was pacing the room like a caged animal, occasionally shooting glances at her that seemed to be measuring, calculating, deciding. Then he asked a question that stunned her with its unexpectedness. Did anyone else know of her condition? When she admitted that only her maid suspected and that her aunt remained ignorant, he nodded as if a decision had been made. What he proposed next was so extraordinary, so beyond anything Isabella could have imagined, that she initially thought she had misunderstood. Lord Thomas Blackmore, heir to the Earl of Ravensdale, was proposing marriage. Not to his brother, that ship had quite literally sailed, but to himself. He would claim the child as his own, provide Isabella with the protection of his name and position, and ensure that neither she nor her child would suffer for Benedict's perfidy. It would be a marriage of convenience, he stressed, a legal arrangement to prevent scandal and provide security. He asked for nothing from her beyond discretion and the maintenance of appearances. Isabella's first instinct was to refuse. The very idea seemed absurd, impossible, almost insulting in its presumption. But Lord Thomas continued, outlining his reasoning with the same precision he might use for a business proposition. His father's health was failing. The Earl might not survive the year. As the new Earl, Thomas would have the power and resources to protect her completely. More importantly, he had no intention of marrying for love anyway, having devoted himself entirely to the preservation and improvement of the family estates. A wife who understood the nature of their arrangement, who would not make emotional demands upon him, would suit his purposes admirably. There was also, he admitted with painful honesty, the matter of justice. His family had wronged her grievously. His brother had destroyed her life for sport. While Thomas could not undo that wrong, he could at least prevent its consequences from destroying her entirely. He saw it as a matter of honor, perhaps the only way to salvage any honor from the situation. The wedding, such as it was, took place 3 days later by special license in a small church in Marylebone. Lord Thomas had moved with military efficiency to arrange matters. The license procured through channels that did not ask awkward questions, witnesses recruited from among his most trusted servants, a modista summoned to provide Isabella with appropriate attire that suggested respectability rather than romance. The ceremony itself was brief to the point of terseness, the vows exchanged with all the passion of a legal contract, which, Lord Thomas had made clear, was essentially what they were entering. Isabella stood at the altar in a dove-gray silk dress that had been hastily altered to fit her still slight frame, wondering at the strange turns of fate that had brought her to this moment. The man beside her, who looked so much like the one who had ruined her, yet seemed constructed of entirely different material, spoke his vows with clear determination. When he placed the ring on her finger, a simple gold band, nothing like the false trinket his brother had given her, his touch was impersonal but oddly reassuring in its steadiness. The journey back to Bath to collect her belongings and inform her aunt required delicate handling. Lord Thomas had constructed an elaborate fiction that contained just enough truth to be believable. They had met during his brief visit to Bath earlier in the year. True, though it had been Benedict she had met. They had corresponded secretly. The letters had existed, though from the wrong brother. They had married quickly due to his father's declining health and wished to see his heir settled. The Earl was indeed ill, though he had no knowledge of this particular settlement. Mrs. Whitmore received the news with a combination of shock, delight, and deep suspicion that her niece had been conducting a clandestine romance. The elevation from modest gentility to future countess was so dramatic that it overshadowed any questions about propriety or haste. Lord Thomas played his part with convincing gravitas, presenting himself as a man deeply in love, but constrained by duty to move quickly. He spoke of taking Isabella to his estate in Yorkshire immediately, where the air would be beneficial for her delicate constitution, a fiction that would explain her absence during the months when her condition would become obvious. The estate, Thornfield Hall, proved to be a revelation. Where Isabella had expected something cold and imposing, matching its master's demeanor, she found instead a beautifully maintained property that spoke of centuries of careful stewardship. The gardens were extensive without being ostentatious, the house itself grand but somehow welcoming, the servants efficient but kind. Lord Thomas had sent word ahead, and Isabella was received as the lady of the house with a deference that felt simultaneously appropriate and surreal. Their living arrangements reflected the nature of their agreement. Isabella was given a suite of rooms in the east wing, elegant and comfortable, with a sitting room where she could receive visitors when the time came for her to do so. Lord Thomas occupied his traditional chambers in the West Wing, and they met only at dinner, a formal affair where they discussed household matters and safe topics like books and estate management. He was unfailingly courteous, occasionally kind, but maintained an emotional distance that reminded Isabella daily of the true nature of their arrangement. As autumn progressed into winter and Isabella's condition became increasingly apparent, she found herself oddly grateful for this distance. She was able to grieve properly for the future she had lost, the love that had been false, the innocence that had been stolen. Lord Thomas never intruded on this grief, but she occasionally caught him watching her with an expression she could not quite decipher. Not pity exactly, but something that might have been understanding. The servants, if they suspected anything unusual about the timing of their marriage and her condition, were too well trained or too loyal to show it. The housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, was particularly kind, ensuring Isabella had everything she might need for her comfort without ever asking awkward questions. The local doctor, summoned by Lord Thomas, was discreet and professional, speaking of the heir's arrival as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It was during these quiet months that Isabella began to truly observe the man she had married. Lord Thomas Blackmore was unlike any gentleman of her acquaintance. He rose before dawn to ride his estates, spent hours in his study managing accounts and correspondence, and knew every tenant by name. He had no vices that she could discern. He drank sparingly, never gambled, and showed no interest in the sporting pursuits that occupied most men of his class. His entire existence seemed devoted to the preservation and improvement of his heritage. Yet there were moments when she glimpsed something else beneath the dutiful exterior. She caught him once in the library, completely absorbed in a volume of poetry, his face softened by what he was reading. Another time, she observed him from her window playing with the gamekeeper's children, his usual gravity abandoned as he let them climb over him like a living mountain. These glimpses suggested depths that his rigid self-control usually concealed. The news of the Earl's death arrived in January, delivered by express rider on a day when snow had transformed Thornfield into a crystalline wonderland. Lord Thomas received the news with no visible emotion, merely nodding and beginning immediately to make the necessary arrangements. But that evening at dinner, Isabella noticed his hands trembling slightly as he cut his meat, the only sign that the loss of his father had affected him more than he would admit. The transformation of Lord Thomas Blackmore from mere lord to Earl of Ravensdale brought changes both subtle and profound to their strange household. There were the obvious alterations, the black crepe of mourning, the steady stream of letters requiring response, the visits from solicitors and estate managers bearing documents requiring signature. But there were also shifts in the very air of Thornfield, as if the house itself recognized that its master had assumed his full authority. Isabella, now Countess of Ravensdale, in name if not in truth, found her position equally transformed. The deference that had been respectful before became almost reverential. Communications arrived, addressed to her regarding charitable obligations, social functions, and the thousand small duties that fell to a woman of her new rank. Lord Thomas, she could not yet think of him as simply Thomas, despite their marriage, instructed her to handle these as she saw fit, trusting her judgment with a confidence that surprised them both. As February arrived, and with it the approaching time of her confinement, Isabella noticed a change in her husband's behavior. Where before he had maintained a careful distance, now he began to show small signs of concern. He inquired about her health at breakfast as well as dinner. He had the fire in her sitting room built higher, concerned about drafts. Once, finding her struggling to reach a book from a high shelf in the library, he not only retrieved it, but had a selection of volumes moved to lower shelves for her convenience. The day the pains began, a late February morning with snow falling thick and fast. Lord Thomas surprised everyone, including himself, by refusing to follow the convention of male absence. While he did not intrude upon the birthing chamber itself, he stationed himself in the adjoining room, pacing with such intensity that Mrs. Patterson later reported he had worn a visible path in the carpet. When the infant's cry finally pierced the air after 14 hours of labor, the relief on his face was so profound that the housekeeper found herself moved to tears. The child was a boy, healthy and perfect, with a shock of dark hair that could have come from either Blackmore brother. When Lord Thomas was finally admitted to see him, Isabella watched nervously as he approached the bed where she lay exhausted, the infant in her arms. The expression on his face as he looked at the child was complex beyond interpretation. There was pain there, certainly, the knowledge of whose child this really was, but also something else, something that looked remarkably like tenderness. He declared the child would be called James, after his grandfather. James Edmund Blackmore, Viscount Thornfield. The use of his secondary title for the boy, the formal acknowledgement of him as heir, was more than Isabella had dared hope. When Thomas reached out to touch the infant's tiny fist, and those miniature fingers wrapped around his larger one with instinctive trust, something shifted in his face, a softening that transformed his stern features entirely. Over the following weeks, as Isabella recovered and the household adjusted to its newest member, she observed with growing amazement the change in her husband. He visited the nursery daily, often when he thought no one would notice. She once discovered him there at dawn, holding James with surprising expertise, talking to the infant in a low voice about estate management and crop rotation, as if the baby could understand every word. When she made to withdraw, not wanting to intrude, he called her back. He said the child should know his mother's voice as well, and thus began a new pattern in their lives. They would meet in the nursery, initially just to tend to James, but gradually these meetings extended into conversations. Thomas revealed knowledge about infant care that surprised her until he admitted, with some embarrassment, that he had been reading medical texts on the subject. Isabella found herself sharing stories of her own childhood, memories of her father that she had not thought of in years. It was during one of these nursery conversations, on a March morning when spring was beginning to assert itself against winter's grip, that Thomas revealed something that changed Isabella's understanding of everything that had come before. Benedict, he told her, had written from Rome. Not to her, Thomas would not have permitted that, but to him, asking for money. In the letter, Benedict had made reference to that bath business with such casual dismissal that Thomas had been moved to a fury Isabella had never seen in him before. Benedict had called her a pretty little fool in the letter, Thomas revealed with controlled anger. He had actually boasted about how easily she had been taken in. He seemed to think Thomas would find it amusing. Thomas's hands clenched and unclenched as he spoke. He had written back to inform Benedict that he was no longer welcome at any family property, that his allowance was permanently suspended, and that should he return to England, he would find no acknowledgement from Thomas. Benedict was, in effect, dead to this family. The vehemence of this declaration, the protective fury behind it, stirred something in Isabella that she had thought destroyed forever. This man who had married her out of duty, who had claimed her child as his own out of honor, was revealing himself capable of deep feeling, even if that feeling was currently manifested as anger on her behalf. She reached out impulsively and touched his hand, the first voluntary physical contact between them since their wedding day. She told him softly that he did not have to do that Benedict was his brother. Thomas replied with flat certainty that James was his son, she was his wife, and that was his family. Benedict had chosen to exclude himself through his actions. Spring brought with it not just the usual renewal of the Yorkshire landscape, but a gradual thawing of the careful boundaries that had defined the Ravensdale marriage. It began with small things. Thomas offering Isabella his arm during walks in the garden without the prompting of social necessity. Isabella seeking his opinion on household matters that she was perfectly capable of deciding herself. They began taking tea together in the afternoon, initially to discuss James's progress, but increasingly simply for the pleasure of conversation. The revelation of true feeling came about through calamity, as such revelations often do. In April, James developed a fever that transformed their thriving infant into a frighteningly still figure whose labored breathing echoed through the house like a countdown to disaster. The doctor, summoned from York at desperate speed, could offer little beyond the usual remedies and the hollow comfort that infants either recovered from such fevers or did not, and only time would tell. For 3 days and nights, Isabella and Thomas maintained a vigil that stripped away all pretense between them. They took turns bathing the baby with cool cloths, administering the prescribed medicines, walking him when he cried, and holding him when he fell into fitful sleep. The careful distance they had maintained evaporated in the face of shared terror. Thomas held Isabella when she wept from exhaustion and fear. She forced him to eat when he would have forgotten. So focused was he on watching for any change in James's condition. On the third night, when the fever finally broke and James opened his eyes with their usual bright curiosity, the relief was so overwhelming that Isabella collapsed against Thomas's chest, sobbing with a release of tension that seemed to come from her very soul. He held her then, not with the careful propriety of duty, but with the desperate clutch of a man who has nearly lost everything precious to him. When she finally raised her tear-stained face to his, what she saw there made her heart stop. Thomas spoke roughly, his own eyes suspiciously bright. He could not do this anymore. He could not pretend that she and James were mere responsibilities to be managed. He could not maintain this fiction that their marriage was simply a legal convenience. Watching James suffer, watching her suffer, he had been forced to acknowledge a truth he had been fighting since the day she walked into his study. Isabella waited, hardly daring to breathe, as he struggled to find words for feelings he had never intended to acknowledge. He loved her, he said finally, the words seeming to surprise him even as he spoke them. Not because duty required it, not because honor demanded it, but because somewhere between her courage in telling him the truth and her grace in accepting his proposition, between her devotion to James and her kindness to everyone in this household, she had become essential to his very existence. He loved her, and if she could not return that feeling, he understood, but he could not face another night like this without telling her the truth. Isabella's response came not in words, but in action. She raised herself on her toes and kissed him, their first true kiss, tasting of tears and relief and the promise of something neither had expected to find. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, she smiled with a radiance that transformed her tired face. She used his given name for the first time. Thomas, she said. She had been in love with him since the day he held James for the first time and spoke to him about crop rotation. She had loved him since he banished his brother for insulting her. She had loved him since he gave her dignity when she deserved only shame. How could she not love a man who took another's sin and transformed it into grace? The transformation of their marriage from that night forward was both dramatic and subtle. To the outside world, little changed. They were still the Earl and Countess of Ravensdale, still maintaining the proprieties expected of their station. But within Thornfield, the very air seemed lighter. Thomas smiled more, an expression that took years off his appearance. Isabella sang as she went about her days, filling the house with music it had not heard in decades. James thrived under the attention of two parents who had found in each other what neither had dared hope for. Summer brought unexpected visitors in the form of Mrs. Whitmore, come to inspect her niece's elevated circumstances and meet her great-nephew. If she noticed that James seemed rather robust for a child supposedly born prematurely, she kept such observations to herself. What she did comment on, with considerable satisfaction, was the obvious devotion between the Earl and his Countess. She declared with historical revision that would have been amusing if it were not so earnest, that she always knew Isabella would make a splendid match, that she had such natural dignity. The true test of their new happiness came in September with the news that Benedict had died in Rome, apparently in a duel over another man's wife. Thomas received the news with a complexity of emotion that Isabella was now privileged to witness and share. There was grief, certainly, for the brother he had once known before corruption took hold. There was anger at the waste of a life that might have been productive. But there was also a kind of release, the closing of a chapter that had threatened to overshadow their future. They attended the memorial service in London, presenting a united front to society's curious eyes. If anyone noticed that the Countess of Ravensdale wore her mourning with perhaps less devastation than might be expected for a sister-in-law, or that the Earl seemed more protective than mournful, such observations were kept to whispers. The only moment of potential disaster came when a young woman approached them after the service, clearly pregnant and equally clearly desperate, asking to speak to the Earl privately about a matter concerning Lord Benedict. Isabella watched with pride as her husband handled the situation with the same grace he had shown her. The young woman was provided for, her child would be educated, but there would be no acknowledgement beyond financial support. It was, Thomas explained to Isabella later, the least and most he could do. Enough to prevent suffering, not enough to encourage others to come forward with similar claims. There had been, he admitted wearily, 2 other such arrangements already in place from Benedict's earlier indiscretions. Isabella asked how many lives Benedict had damaged, holding James closer as she contemplated how different her own fate might have been. Thomas replied that it had been too many. But perhaps some good could come from evil. Without Benedict's cruelty, he would never have found her. Without his betrayal, James would not exist. Without his sin, they would not have discovered this unexpected grace. As autumn deepened into winter, Isabella found herself pregnant again, this time within the bonds of a true marriage. Thomas's joy at the news was profound and uncomplicated, any lingering ghosts of their beginning finally laid to rest. When she expressed concern that he might love this child more than James, as it would truly be his, he looked at her with genuine bewilderment. James was his son, he said simply. He became his the moment Thomas gave him his name, more his with each day he had raised him, completely his when he realized he would die to protect him. Biology was merely the beginning of fatherhood, not its definition. This new child would be loved equally, not more. How could he favor one star over another in his sky? The following spring brought a daughter, whom they named Eleanor after Isabella's mother. She had Thomas's grave eyes and Isabella's golden hair, a combination that promised future beauty. James, now toddling about with determined curiosity, regarded his sister with the protective instinct that would characterize their relationship throughout their lives. Watching Thomas carry both children, one on each arm, through the gardens of Thornfield, Isabella often reflected on the strange paths by which happiness could arrive. 10 years had passed since that desperate day when Isabella Crawford had stood outside Ravensdale House, abandoned and ruined. Now, as the Countess of Ravensdale, she presided over one of the most respected households in Yorkshire, mother to 5 children, beloved wife to a man whose devotion had only deepened with time. The woman who entered her morning room on a crisp October day was a stranger, but something in her desperate eyes was all too familiar. The young woman's story was depressingly similar to Isabella's own. Seduced, abandoned, pregnant, desperate. The seducer was not Benedict this time, but another such man, as they seemed to breed in every generation. She had come to the Countess of Ravensdale because she had heard, through whispers and rumors, that Lady Ravensdale had a particular sympathy for women in distress. Isabella listened to the tale with the same grave attention Thomas had once given her own confession. When the young woman finished, trembling with fear and shame, Isabella made a decision that would establish a tradition that would last for generations. She offered the girl sanctuary, employment, and when the child came, assistance in establishing a new life, either in England or abroad, as she preferred. The girl asked through her tears why Isabella would help her. Isabella replied, thinking of Thomas, of James, of all the unexpected blessings that had emerged from disaster, that she had learned that redemption often came from the most unexpected sources, and that love, true love, had the power to transform even the darkest situations into light. When she told Thomas that evening about their new house guest, he merely nodded and asked what arrangements needed to be made. This too had become their pattern. Isabella's compassion balanced by Thomas's pragmatism, creating between them a force for good that rippled out through their county and beyond. The Ravensdale Fund for Distressed Gentlewomen, established quietly and without fanfare, would eventually help hundreds of women rebuild lives destroyed by the carelessness of men. James grew into a young man who combined the best qualities of both his parents, Isabella's warmth and Thomas's integrity. He never learned the truth of his biological parentage, though when he reached his majority, Thomas offered to tell him. James's response was characteristic of the man he had become. He stated that Thomas was his father in every way that mattered. Whatever truth Thomas might tell him could only diminish that reality, never enhance it. Eleanor and her siblings, William, Margaret, and little Thomas, grew up in a household where love was demonstrated not through grand gestures, but through daily kindness, where duty and affection were not opposites but complementary forces. They would all make good marriages, found happy families, and carry forward the lesson their parents had taught them. That love could bloom in the most unlikely soil. That honor could emerge from dishonor. That redemption was always possible for those brave enough to seize it. Isabella often stood at the window of Thornfield, looking out over the estates that had become her true home, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. The girl who had been seduced by false promises had been transformed into a woman who understood the value of true commitment. The victim of one brother's cruelty had become the salvation of another's loneliness. The ruined woman had become the cornerstone of a dynasty built not on bloodlines, but on choice, not on tradition, but on love. Thomas would find her there sometimes, standing at that window, and would know, without asking, what she was thinking. He would wrap his arms around her from behind, rest his chin on her head, and they would stand together in comfortable silence, contemplating the strange alchemy that had transformed disaster into triumph. Neither believed in fate, but both acknowledged that something beyond mere chance had been at work in their story. Thomas asked once, on their 20th anniversary, if she ever regretted it, if she ever wished she had come to this life through a more conventional path. Isabella turned in his arms to face him, seeing in his face the years of shared joy and sorrow, triumph and struggle, the 1,000 small moments that had built their life together. She asked how she could regret the path when she was so grateful for the destination. They were both broken in different ways. His brother broke her heart and her reputation. But in healing each other, they became whole in a way neither of them could have achieved alone. She reached up to touch his face, still handsome though marked now by years of sun and wind from riding his estates, from being the kind of earl who knew every field and every tenant. She would not change a single moment, not even the painful ones, because each step led her to him, led them to this. And so another tale of hearts united reaches its blessed conclusion. Love, it seems, finds a way even through the strictest conventions of proper society, even through betrayal and abandonment, even through the most unlikely circumstances. For in the end, it is not how love begins that matters, but how it endures, how it transforms, how it redeems. The Crawford girl who had been sold a false promise of love had found instead something far more valuable, a true partnership, a real family. A love that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger for the burning. Such stories are rare, but not unique. In every generation, in every level of society, there are those who must learn that love's true triumph lies not in passion's first flame, but in devotion's steady light. Not in the easy path, but in the courage to forge a new one when the old has crumbled to ash. Isabella and Thomas Blackmore had learned this lesson well, and in learning it, had written their own story across the Yorkshire sky. A story of unexpected grace, of honor from dishonor, of love's ultimate victory over circumstance. The children and grandchildren who would come after them would know the legend, if not all the details. Of how the Earl of Ravensdale had married for honor and discovered love, how the Countess had been saved from ruin only to become the salvation of others, how a family had been built not on deception, but on truth, not on obligation, but on choice. They would know that Thornfield Hall stood not just as a monument to wealth and position, but as a testament to love's transformative power. In the portrait that hangs still in Thornfield's gallery, Thomas and Isabella stand together, their children arranged around them, James prominent as the heir, no different in the artist's treatment from his siblings. Those who know where to look can see it. The slight touch of their hands, not required by the pose, but insisted upon by the subjects. The way their bodies incline toward each other like plants toward the sun. The peace in their faces that speaks of battles won and happiness earned rather than inherited. And if, sometimes, a young woman in trouble finds her way to Thornfield's doors, drawn by whispers of sanctuary, she finds their practical assistance without questions or judgment. The true Ravensdale legacy is not spoken of in drawing rooms or recorded in family histories. It exists in the quiet acts of kindness, in the second chances given without fanfare, in the understanding that sometimes the most unlikely beginnings can lead to the most solid foundations. This, then, is what remains of that desperate girl who stood outside Ravensdale House so many years ago. and the stern man who chose, against all convention, to open his door. Not a fairy tale of romance, but something more substantial. A marriage built on honor that grew into devotion. A family founded on choice rather than blood. A quiet understanding that love, real love, is less about grand gestures and more about daily choosing to stand together against whatever storms may come. And so we leave them, Thomas and Isabella Blackmore, Earl and Countess of Ravensdale, not as romantic heroes, but as something more valuable. Two people who found in each other not completion, but companionship, not passion, but partnership, and in finding these things, discovered a love more enduring than either had thought possible. The abandoned girl and the dutiful heir, bound together first by circumstance, then by choice, and finally by a devotion too deep for words, proving that sometimes the most unexpected paths lead to the truest destinations.